Okay, good afternoon everybody. It is time to begin and we are starting chapter 3, new material which we will cover for the first part of this next segment. And chapter 3 has to do with informal fallacies, although 3.1 actually talks about all types of fallacies. It is a rather short chapter. The homework will be on 3.1 and it is rather small. Why? Because we're not going to finish 3.2 today. That's why it is 3.2.1 and we will finish it on Tuesday. 3.1 itself is too small for a whole class. 3.2 is too big. So it's kind of a combination. Okay, let's look at what is a fallacy. What exactly is a fallacy? A fallacy is a defect in an argument, and it can arise from either one of two things. Either mistaken reasoning or the creation of an illusion that makes a bad argument appear good. In the first case, mistaken reasoning, that typically is something we would see in deductive arguments, and the second one in inductive arguments. Latin term for the fallacy is non sequitur, meaning it does not follow. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. Now first let's look at formal fallacies. We actually will deal with formal fallacies much later in class, mainly chapters 5 and 6 deal with formal fallacies. Right now we will concentrate on informal ones. However, you should know the difference right away. A formal fallacy is an error in reasoning that involves explicit use of invalid form. Remember that form of an argument is something which determines its validity, and in deductive arguments we can identify certain formal problems and say that it is a formal fallacy committed. For this reason, formal fallacies, we will only see them in deductive arguments. Something like this: if 2523 is divisible by 9, then it's divisible by 3. 2523 is divisible by 3, therefore it's divisible by 9. Now if you know math, you know this is actually not how it works. It is perfectly true that if this number is divisible by 9, then of course it will be divisible by 3. Any number which is divisible by 9 is divisible by 3. Now the fact that the number is divisible by 3 now doesn't mean that it is divisible by 9. Here is a simple example: 30, right? You can immediately see 30 is divisible by 3. You'll get 10. Is it divisible by 9? No, it's not. So while it works this way, it doesn't work the other way. But the fallacy here is a formal fallacy. And we will learn that in chapter 6 when we look more specifically at formal fallacies. For now, just remember that since it is a type of deductive argument, right? It is a hypothetical syllogism. Therefore, it will, if it has a fallacy, the fallacy will be with the form of this argument. Another type of fallacy which can also occur in hypothetical syllogisms, called denying the antecedent. Something like this: if good intentions make good sermons, then Reverend McGuire is a good preacher. Unfortunately they don't, so he is not. This is the form of this argument, and again, like I said, we will deal with these types of fallacies in the end of class. Categorical syllogisms similarly can have formal fallacies. This is an example. We did some of them before when we tried to analyze it with the circles. We'll do a lot more of this in chapter 5. Until then, just remember that if it is a categorical syllogism, then it will have a formal fallacy. Informal fallacies. Now we see them in inductive arguments. Inductive argument, even if it doesn't follow a particular form, or if it does, regardless of that, it would have only fallacies dealing with the content rather than the form of an argument. Why? Well, if you make an analogy, for example, the analogy itself is an analogy. The form of it is an analogy comparing two things. Now, the only way to determine whether there is a fallacy is to look at the content of this analogy. This is a good example of informal fallacy. The Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms. Atoms are invisible. Therefore, the Brooklyn Bridge is invisible. Now, you can immediately see there's a problem there, right? If you look at the conclusion, it doesn't make any sense. Brooklyn Bridge is invisible. Well, we all know it is visible. But if you look at the premises, don't they seem perfectly true? I mean, isn't it true that Brooklyn Bridge is made of atoms? I'm pretty sure it is. Isn't it true that atoms are invisible? Yes, equally true. So what exactly is the problem here? What is going on? Well, the problem is the quality of being invisible is improperly transferred. It does attach two atoms by themselves. It does not equally apply to collections of atoms. The collections of atoms, while single atoms are invisible, the collections of atoms are perfectly visible. Once you get enough of them together, they become visible. So this is what the problem is in this case. How do you classify informal fallacies? Now, there are different ways to classify them. Aristotle was one of the first who actually tried to classify them. He found 13 of them, divided them into two groups. Since then, there's been various attempts. Different logic books even today have different classification. If you look at any other logic book, you will see that some of them actually are different from this book, which we're using for this class. They have more fallacies or less fallacies, some of them named differently, and so on. It doesn't really matter that much. This is not as precise of a science as mathematics. In terms of informal fallacies, there could be different ways to classify them. The major ones, though, you should know, and the major ones are more or less the same, and that will help you greatly to identify what is a fallacy in reasoning. So we will cover 5 groups of fallacies: fallacies of relevance, weak induction, presumption, ambiguity, and illicit transference. And we will in total talk about 22 fallacies. This is what this book covers. May seem like a lot, actually not that difficult. And for the purposes of the test, you will see that, especially once you do exercises, you'll get a hang of it. It will become much easier for you to identify them. Hopefully you will do well on the exam identifying them. But pay attention, because we will be doing exercises even today, as usual, for extra credit. And in order to do them successfully, you need to pay attention. Ideally, take notes, just like in a classroom. It is again a good idea. You may want to rewatch it later, but even if you want extra credit, you certainly should do it right now and should pay close attention to what I'm saying. Some words of caution. Of course, you cannot again automatically apply that. In some cases, it may be a fallacy committed which we didn't cover, right? We're not going to cover all of them, or it may not exactly fit any of the patterns which we describe. So don't try to automatically apply this. This is not a very precise science. Okay, let's do a little exercise. This is, by the way, the entire content of 3.1. Like I said, it is very small. This is what the homework will be on, and this is the exercise on it for the first extra credit. Identify these fallacies, whether they're formal or informal, for all 3 arguments presented. All 3 of them, by the way, do have fallacies. But the question is, are they formal or informal? And if you give me correct answer, you get the extra credit. The first person. Okay, well, that is incorrect. Anybody else? That is also incorrect. Jacob is correct. So let's look at them a little closer. The first one, everything that runs has feet. Columbia River runs very swiftly. Therefore, Columbia River has feet. Why would it be a formal fallacy? What is the form of this argument? It doesn't even have a form, does it? There's no particular form here. If you think it is a form, then you are mistaken. However, there is an informal fallacy. Okay, let me check up that the second extra credit. Okay, next one, all people who believe blah blah blah. Now this is a categorical syllogism. Of course, as a categorical syllogism, if it has fallacy, that would be a formal fallacy. And finally, the last one is the funniest of them all. Renowned violinist Pinchas Zuckerman has said, "When it comes to vodka, Smirnov plays second fiddle to none." We must therefore conclude that Smirnov is the best vodka available. Well, remember, what specific type of an argument is it? Can you more specifically classify it? No? No idea? What is he doing? Right? They are authority, exactly. Well, inductive. It's an inductive argument. It wouldn't have to necessarily be a fallacy if the authority was good. But in this case, the violinist Pinchas Zuckerman is telling us what is a good vodka. Why is the violinist talking about the vodka? He's not even Russian. I mean, if he was at least Russian, right? He would be a little bit of an authority, but he's not even Russian. And he tries to tell us that Smirnov is a good vodka. What does he know about it? By the way, he's completely wrong. Smirnov is not a good vodka. But anyway, I'm not advertising vodka here, so doesn't matter. In any case, he's not an authority on vodka. So the problem here is not with the form of an argument, but with the content of an argument. Who exactly are they using as an authority? Okay, so good job. Second extra credit for Jacob. Fallacies of relevance. There is a whole host of them. Like I said, we're not even going to cover all of them today. We will finish it next Tuesday, but let's look at them nonetheless. Some of them are better than others, some of them more interesting than others. All of them have one thing in common: relevance. In particular, the conclusion may seem psychologically relevant to the premises, but it is logically irrelevant. Well, if it was completely irrelevant to the conclusion, then of course we would not even use it as an argument, right? If you have premises which have nothing to do with the conclusion, such as the sun is shining brightly, therefore you should vote for Biden in the next elections, now that would not be even an argument really, because the fact that the sun is shining brightly has absolutely nothing to do with the conclusion you are trying to draw. But in some cases, it may psychologically be related. However, logically, there is no valid connection there, no strong connection. So let's look at some of them. Well, yeah, there is an emotional connection. That's another thing to mention. So there is an emotional, psychological connection of some sort. This is 8 fallacies of relevance we will cover in this class. Appeal to force, appeal to pity, appeal to the people, which can be direct or indirect, argument against the person, accident, straw man, and the next Tuesday we'll do this to missing the point and red herring. So appeal to force. This is a very primitive one. It's actually pretty good for students to be able to recognize it on the exam, because it's generally easy to understand. The logic here is very, very brutally simple. Something like, if you don't accept the argument, something bad will happen to you. I'll beat you up, somebody will beat you up, or whatever. Something like a child can tell a playmate, Sesame Street is the best show on TV, and if you don't believe it, I'm going to call my big brother over here and he's going to beat you up. Very straightforward, right? For a child, that makes sense. Do adults make this kind of fallacies? Well, yes, they do sometimes, deliberately. They can say something like this: a lobbyist to a senator. Senator Casey, of course you support our bill to reduce inheritance taxes. After all, you wouldn't want the press to find out about all the contributions you received from Ku Klux Klan. Note that the logic is essentially similar. Like, you will vote for it. Why? Well, not because it's a good bill, but because we are threatening you. Something bad can happen. In both cases, you may say there is a missing premise, right? Something like, in the first case, if my brother forces you to admit that Sesame Street is the best show on TV, then Sesame Street is in fact the best show on TV. And of course, it's fallacious. Same thing here. If I succeed in threatening you, then you support the bill to reduce inheritance taxes. Now, we would hope that our senators are deciding this based on something more respectable than just fear of repercussions, although very often they unfortunately do. Okay, what is the fallacy here? Well, the fallacy obviously is the fact that the conclusion should not be accepted based on fear. Appeal to pity. Slightly more interesting type of a fallacy, essentially that is committed when instead of logically supporting the conclusion, somebody is just trying to evoke pity and have the reader or listener to accept the conclusion based on that. When would it happen? Well, sometimes in court, for example, it can happen. A taxpayer could tell the judge something like this: Your Honor, I admit that I declared 13 children as dependents on my tax return, even though I only have 2. But if you find me guilty of tax evasion, my reputation will be ruined. I'll probably lose my job. My poor wife will not be able to have the operation she desperately needs, and my kids will starve. Surely I'm not guilty. So note that he is not saying that he is not guilty based on some sort of relevant facts. He's just trying to evoke pity. If you find me guilty, all these bad things will happen. Okay, keep in mind always the difference between logical and psychological relevance. It does seem psychologically relevant, even in this case, that all this stuff, bad things will happen. Therefore, you may be tempted to say, in some cases, perhaps we should not find him guilty, but it's not logically relevant. In fact, in court, they very often play on this stuff, in particular in front of the juries, because unlike the judges, who are generally better trained and they have better grasp of logic, juries are regular folks. And regular folks very often didn't take Philosophy 102. They're not very good at this stuff. So they may be swayed by arguments which are not very logically sound, but in the same time appeal to their emotions. Something like a defense lawyer may say, You have heard that my client was seen in the vicinity of the crime scene on the day of the murder. But look at his narrow shoulders and frightened eyes. This is a man, a boy really, more sinned against than sinning. Right? So, similar logic. He's trying to tell them that his client is innocent, but not because of the relevant facts. Because look at him. How could he committed the crime? Well, if we know anything about criminal justice and so on, we of course know that many people who do not look like they can commit the crime did commit them. Like a famous case of Ted Bundy comes to mind. This serial killer who looked like, a very nice person, this all-American sweetheart, and many people didn't believe he could ever be a serial killer. But it was actually established beyond reasonable doubt that he is one. So clearly this type of approach doesn't work. You should look at the facts, not at how the person looks like. So this is why we should again use logic rather than emotions, especially in court. Now, in some cases there again can be exceptions. For example, instead of appeal to pity, you can have an argument from compassion. Cases when compassion is relevant. The circumstances could be relevant for whatever conclusion. If somebody is asking for help for whatever reason, it is of course relevant whether they need the help. So here's an example from the book. Please help. On July 20, 2011, the United Nations declared a famine in parts of Somalia. On August 3, 2011, the United Nations declared that the famine has spread to 3 more regions of Somalia, including the camps for displaced families in the capital Mogadishu. Malnutritional levels for children have soared. In many regions of Somalia, 30 to 50% of children are malnourished. The United Nations estimate that 29,000 children under the age of 5 have already died, while 640,000 Somali children are acutely malnourished and at risk of dying, unless helped immediately. So note that there is no fallacy here. They're asking for help, and they're providing evidence why this help is needed. So don't assume automatically just because somebody is asking for help that is a fallacy. It is only fallacy when these circumstances are irrelevant, which is why we're talking about fallacies of relevance. Number 3. This is a very good group of fallacies. Appeal to the people. Argumentum ad populum. By the way, they do have Latin names because most of them are known since medieval times or even before that, and back then they used to call them by the Latin names. We still use these Latin names, especially for some of them. So in this case, that is such a fallacy with the Latin name to it. What is appeal to the people? Typically it is the type of an argument which uses human desire to be loved, esteemed, admired, valued, or recognized by others to get the reader or listener to accept a conclusion. Now, they can be of 2 varieties, direct and indirect, but all of them have something in common, that they always go like you want to be accepted, included in the group, loved, esteemed, whatever. Therefore, you should accept X, Y, Z as true. How do we distinguish between direct and indirect? Well, direct approach typically is addressing a large group of people, some sort of a gathering. So when some sort of a gathering is in front of you and you're making a speech, and you try to excite the emotions or enthusiasm of this crowd in order to accept some sort of conclusion you have, that would be a direct approach of appeal to the people. Some sort of a exciting mob mentality, you may say. Typically, this is what politicians do. This is a good example here from the book. I look out at all of you and I tell you I'm proud to be here. Proud to belong to a party that stands for what is good for America. Proud to cast my lot with the kind of people who make this nation great. Proud to stand with men and women who can get our nation back on its feet. Yes, there are those who criticize us, who label our view of trade agreements as protectionist. But when I look at you hard-working people, I know we are right and the critics are wrong. So you may wonder, like, what exactly is wrong here? Well, for one thing, think about it in this way. Typically, like, we have 2 major parties, right? The Republican and Democrats. Typically, the party has this list of stuff, the whole list of stuff which they are proposing. Do people necessarily agree with all that? Well, not necessarily. There may be some things they agree completely. There may be some things which they kind of, they're neutral on that subject. There may be some things which they don't even agree. But this type of mob mentality does kind of drive you towards agreeing and buying this whole package together without distinguishing. Well, this particular example, we can look at what is going on right now in this country and see something there of the sort, right? Traditionally, Republican Party was against protectionism. They traditionally were for free trade. Free trade. That's one of their core values. Now, recently, it seems like with President Trump, protectionism is in favor. Now, why do people who believe in free trade still vote for President Trump? well, they probably like some other stuff, such as the Second Amendment, the abortion, whatever else. And so, based on this whole package, they may even, again, justify it to themselves and say, yeah, he is protectionist, and I am against that, but overall, he is standing for all these other values which I believe in. So maybe protectionism is not even that bad. Maybe I personally can convince myself that it is fine. So note that this is a similar type of logic, right? And then we all in it together. We are this party which is for what is good for America. Therefore, we will all support all this stuff. And we will wear these MAGA hats and we will go to those rallies. And that will help us feel like we actually are all supporting that. Well, I don't even want to be partisan here. It could apply to Democrats too. I'm sure that there are stuff in Democratic program which not everybody necessarily agrees. There is more to the left, less to the left, more moderate, less moderate stuff in there too. So in either case, this type of mob mentality is problematic and fallacious, because you really should distinguish for yourself what it is you support and why, and not be swayed by this type of mob mentality. Appeal to fear. This is kind of a variety of that. Again, what happens there is some sort of fear mongering when they bring a certain cases, for example, and try to convince people that certain policy or whatever is necessary based on a fear rather than logic. One example would be illegal immigration, such as very often you hear arguments are made, illegal immigrants are murderers, and then they tell you, look at this guy, he comes from Mexico, illegal immigrant, or whatever other country, and he murdered these people. So he's a legal immigrant and he murdered people, therefore illegal immigrants are all murderers. Well, if you want to evaluate it logically, what you should of course do is look at the statistics and see, for example, are there really more cases of crime committed by illegal immigrants than general population? And if it is in fact true, then you do have some sort of a argument why illegal immigrants are danger. If all you do is pick this one case and bring it into the attention of the public and say, oh, look at that, look at these poor people, their loved one was murdered by a illegal immigrant, all you are doing, you essentially are playing on their fear people have. And this is a fallacy. Indirect approach, that has several varieties. Again, we are talking about appeal to the people, indirect approach. In this case, instead of addressing the whole group, you address individuals. You may even address a lot of individuals, but not as a group. There are several varieties: bandwagon argument, appeal to vanity, appeal to snobbery, and appeal to tradition. That's the ones we will cover. So let's look at them one by one. Bandwagon, that's the very common, typical fallacy. I'm sure you all guys encountered it. Something like this. Everyone nowadays is on low-carb diet, therefore you should go on a low-carb diet too. So the idea is everyone is doing it, so you should do it. Obviously, that is a fallacy. Whether or not you should do something, you should again decide on the merit of it rather than whether everyone is doing it. But it works. It works on a lot of people. Appeal to vanity. Now this is something you would typically see in advertisement. Something like this: Daniel Craig wears an Omega wristwatch. Thus, if you want to be like him, you will buy and wear an Omega wristwatch too. Most of advertisement is based on that, isn't it? What do? They hire these well-known famous people, athletes, movie stars, and so on, and they pay them millions of dollars to advertise their product. And somebody, like say Taylor Swift or whatever, then shows up and wears a particular product, I don't know, Puma sneakers or whatever, and says, oh, this is such a great sneaker, so comfortable, I love them. Oh, and the idea is that you should buy them too for the reason that you admire Taylor Swift and she buys this product, so you should buy it too. Now, what is problematic there? Well, obviously, lots of things are problematic because, for one thing, there's no secret. We know she's paid millions of dollars to advertise this particular product, right? They're not doing it for free. Does she really like the product? Well, we don't even know, right? I mean, more often than not, they may not like them at all. For example, it's possible that she actually wears Nikes all the time. She hates Puma. But if you paid millions of dollars, would you really say no to that and say, no, I don't wear Puma. Why would I, sell my integrity and advertise it? Well, especially if you don't hate Puma but just kind of indifferent, you will say, of course, sure, give me the money. I'll say whatever. And most of these cases are like that. There's no guarantee that Daniel Craig wears a MAGA wristwatch or that Taylor Swift wears Puma sneakers, and whether they even like it, that's an open question. All we know is that they paid a lot of money to say that. Does it work? Oh, you bet it works, otherwise they would not be doing it. What, do you think they're stupid to pay millions of dollars for nothing to these people? They pay this money to them because it works, because people watch that and then they go and buy this product. But is this how you should decide whether to buy this particular brand of sneakers or watches or whatever? Of course not. How should you decide that? Based on your own needs and based on maybe some sort of consumer reviews and so on. Find out what actually works, what is more comfortable for you, what it is that serves your personal needs. Whether or not Daniel Craig or whoever else is wearing it should be completely irrelevant. So that is a fallacy. Similar one also kind of used in advertisement a lot, appeal to snobbery. It's not just used in advertisement, but in advertisement that's a good example of this. This is the one from the book. The Lexus 400 series is not for everyone. Only those with considerable means and accomplishment will acquire one. To show the world that you are among the select few, you will want to purchase and drive one of these distinguished automobiles. So note again that the logic here is basically that very few people can afford it. Show others that you're one of these very few. Select group. Now, is this a fallacy? Definitely. Because if you buy in a car, should you care about whether or not it is a select group? Probably not. What should you care about? Well, do you like the car? Does it drive well? Do you enjoy that? Is it a good value for money? This is the question you should be asking yourself, not whether it is a select few who drive it. So that is another example. Appeal to tradition. Again, this is a good example, and a lot of people actually would say that there's no fallacy with that, when in fact, if you think about it, there is. This is the example from the book. Traditionally, professional sporting events have been preceded by the national anthem. Therefore, professional sporting events should continue to be preceded by the national anthem. Now, you may say that what's the problem? Indeed, that makes sense, right? They've always been preceded by the anthem. Let them be. Well, maybe they should. But here's the question. Should we base it on tradition? Is tradition alone good enough of a reason to continue doing something? What do you guys think? Let's do a quick poll to wake you up a little bit. Do you think it's a good enough of a reason? Yes or no? Okay, well, let's wrap it up. It looks like not everyone is paying attention and participating, and we have, again, strangely few people who left in class. 5 more seconds. Anybody else wants to answer this? Yes? No? Okay. So this is the result then, 6 people think it is a good idea to base something on tradition, and 3 people think it's not. Well, here's the thing now. There's nothing wrong with traditions per se. However, just because it's a tradition is not good enough of a reason. There should be other reasons than that, and they are actually more important. One example of all of us can probably relate for, I can give you. Let's say you have a tradition driving to work or to school this particular way. I, for example, used to drive to college all the time the same route. Right? That's kind of like a tradition too. I keep on doing that. Why am I doing it the same way? Well, there's good reasons for that, because you know how to get there. Right? You know very well what are the traffic lights, what you can expect, and so on. You don't want to change it all the time. So that makes sense. But at one point there was a construction, so I had to change my road. I had no choice. I changed it and I took a different road, and guess what? I find out it's actually even better. I am able to get there much faster than before. So here's the question. Should I go back to the previous one because it's a tradition? Probably not, right? So what is more important in this case? What is more important is whether I get there fast enough and quickly enough. So there's nothing wrong with continuing doing something because you did it before, but that should not be the only reason you're doing that. There better be other reasons. And if all you have is, oh, it's a tradition, then I'm sorry, that's not good enough. In fact, it is often a good idea to break with the tradition, and maybe even if there's no construction, just to try a new and different approach, because it could work better. In fact, almost everything we achieved in this world, we achieved because we broke with some sort of a tradition. If you look back thousands of years, people were living in caves and hunting bison or something, right? That was a tradition. Then somebody emerged from the cave, built a hut or something, and started growing vegetables. And I'm sure that there were people who probably would tell him, what the hell are you doing? For generations, we were hunting bison and living in caves. And you are now breaking with this tradition of our ancestors? Yes, they broke with the tradition, and thank God they did, because that's why we now have this civilization. Otherwise, we would still be living in caves. And almost everything we achieve because at some point we do break with some sort of a tradition and move on. Now, again, it's understandable that there are traditions. Not all of them. You should not reject something just based on the fact that it is a tradition, but you also should not keep it just based on the fact that it is a tradition. That's not good enough of a reason. In fact, it's no reason at all. The reasons may be something like, well, it's the best way to do it, the way we understand it. Well, the case of an anthem in particular, of course, is somewhat more complicated, because it's not really one of those situations when you may care one way or the other, right? So there may be some other questions here. Why do you want to continue that than just instrumental to achieving some sort of result? So, okay, you should ask yourself, why do we do that? Why do we use national anthem? And you may answer yourself, well, that's for the reasons of being patriotic and feeling better about our country and so on. And if that is indeed the case, then you should continue doing that. But note that you are not continuing doing that because of the tradition. You are continuing because the reasons behind it are still remain valid. And the reasons being patriotic and feeling better about your country. That's the difference. If somebody tells you that all the reason behind it is the tradition, then they are wrong. That is not a good case. And I can point at some other tradition of a similar nature. Like Great Britain still has the Queen. And Brits are really crazy about their traditions, so they think it's a good idea. But a lot of people are questioning it, like it's a purely symbolic figure, right? She has no power whatsoever. She hasn't exercised her power in like decades, and probably will not. But she costs a lot of money to the taxpayers. This is taxpayers who flip in the bill on this stuff. And so some people are saying, should we just keep on doing it because of the tradition? And well, that's a big question. Many countries rejected this kind of traditions and moved on from that, but some countries still keep it. So then the other arguments come into play, right? People are no longer saying, well, we should keep it because of the tradition. They saying things like, well, it actually brings tourists. And that is a different argument from the tradition. You may agree or disagree, but note that that's not just the tradition then. So that again maybe makes some sort of a sense, but if all you have is the tradition, that's not a good argument. Okay, well, an example of argument, again based on the tradition, where the conclusion may be true, but the argument itself is bad. The one from the book, traditionally guests have worn elegant clothing to Mrs. Channing's annual cocktail party, therefore it would not be a good idea for you to go naked to a party this year. It may not be a good idea to go naked anywhere, but the reasons are not the tradition in this case. The reasons are that it's just offensive to other people. You may even get arrested and ruin the party for sure. So the tradition actually has nothing to do with that, right? So again, the reasoning here is not based on the tradition, it is based on other motives. Arguments against a person. This is an excellent type of a fallacy, which is very popular, unfortunately, and you guys definitely should know that. Also known as ad hominem, which also means against the person. Typically involves two arguers. One of them advances a certain argument and the other responds by directing attention not to the argument itself, but to the person who is making an argument. That's why it's called against the person. Could be three varieties. You should know the differences between them. We'll go over the differences. Number one, ad hominem abusive. Number two, ad hominem circumstantial. And number three, known as tu quoque. Tu quoque, that's actually Latin too, and it means you too. Okay, so abusive goes like this. Television entertainer Bill Maher argues that religion is just a lot of foolish nonsense. But Maher is arrogant, shameless, self-righteous pig. Obviously his arguments are not worth listening to. I'm sure you guys heard it a lot. And again, psychologically it may seem relevant, right? If somebody is arrogant, shameless, self-righteous pig, why should we listen to their arguments? But from the point of view of logic, you should look at the argument itself, because it is possible that even arrogant, shameless, self-righteous pig may have a good argument. Never mind the fact that some people will disagree about these qualifications. But disregarding that, it shouldn't even matter who is making an argument. The argument should be evaluated on its own merit. It's possible that a very, very bad person makes very, very good argument. A variety of this, which I'm sure you guys heard, and some people love this argument, is what is known as America love it or leave it type argument, when somebody says, oh, if you don't like it, go back to your own country. Why are you criticizing the way we do things? If you don't like it, go back to Russia. Communist Russia, that's where you belong. What is the problem here? Well, it's also a form of abuse, because think about it again logically. If a person lives in this country, especially maybe a citizen of this country, even if he or she comes from Russia or Somalia or any other country in the past, do they not have a right to criticize this country? Not only do they have a right, It's in fact is their obligation as good citizens to voice their opinions on different matters and try to make this country better. Wouldn't you agree that they should try to make this country better? So if they feel something is unjust, if they feel something is done in the wrong way, they have every right to present their argument, and you have every right to disagree with them. But to tell them to go back to their country, that is a form of abuse. And it has nothing to do with the argument they are presenting. Instead of attacking the argument, you are switching it to the person who comes from whatever other place. And therefore, that is a form of a fallacy. Another kind of slightly different example of the same argument, something like this. Billionaire investor Warren Buffett argues that wealthy people should be required to pay more taxes. I would remind Mr. Buffett that he is free to send a check to the Department of Treasury anytime he likes. So, if he thinks it's a good idea, he should do it. But why is he telling us to do it? Now, there's several things about this example which are actually worth exploring. One of them, it is actually true that Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in this country, advertises higher taxes. He says that wealthy people should pay more taxes. Now, why do you think he would do that? It seems kind of counterintuitive, right? He will pay more money. Is that actually in his interest? You don't think so? You don't think it's in his interest? Why? Why do you think it's in his interest? Well, obviously we are speculating here, right? We don't really know what his personal motivation is. But in general, well, kind of. The one thing about it is this. It's a known fact, and especially if you take economics class or any political science class, they will tell you it's a known fact that in this country, for a very long period of time, the following has been taking place. Wealthy people are getting wealthier and wealthier, and poor people are getting more and more poor. So divide is growing. Wealthy people make more money, and poor people make less money. It can, of course, continue, but there may be, a point at which something happens, at which the poor people will become so poor and destitute that they simply had enough. And then what happens? Especially in a country where almost everybody has guns at home. Something may happen which, will not work very well for people like Warren Buffett. The poor people may just take everything. And that is a simple business calculation on the part of wealthy people. Sometimes it's easier to give away a part than to give away everything. Sometimes it makes more sense to pay higher taxes than get a revolution and eventually end up, maybe even dead, right? That's, for example, what happened in Russia. Russia is one example. In 100 years ago, revolution happened, and many wealthy people who had it very, very good suddenly found themselves in a very, very bad situation. So maybe people like Warren Buffett, and again, I don't know what Warren Buffett is thinking, but many wealthy people could use the same logic and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't let it get to that point. Maybe we should do something about it ahead of time. And just, simple business calculation. I give away 10% of my income. That's, for a billionaire, is really not a big deal. Works much better than end up with a bullet to his head, which would not be fun. So that is exactly what could be the calculation here. Well, yeah, but you see, that's why some people become billionaires, because they actually can calculate into the future and figure out what is more profitable for them. People who don't do that usually do not become millionaires and billionaires. But anyway, regardless of that, this is again an example of switching the issue from the argument itself, why should wealthy people pay more taxes, to the person of Warren Buffett and trying to attack him in this way. So this is again an example of the fallacy. Ad hominem circumstantial. How does this one go? Circumstantial would be something like when instead of abusing the person as in the previous case, you are pointing to a circumstance in their life or in their whatever circumstance affecting them, which could make them biased or benefit in some way from the outcome of whatever they're arguing for. Such as this. Dalai Lama argues that China has no business in Tibet and that the West should do something about it. But Dalai Lama just wants Chinese to leave so he can return as a leader. Naturally, he argues this way. Therefore, we should reject his arguments. So the point here is this. Dalai Lama, when he makes an argument that China should get out of Tibet, will benefit as a result of China getting out of Tibet. Therefore, his argument is nonsense. We shouldn't even listen to it. Now, it is true that in many cases people argue for something from which they will benefit. This is very natural for us. In fact, I would say most cases. Why would people even bother arguing for something they're not going to benefit from whatsoever, right? But just because somebody will benefit from the outcome doesn't necessarily mean that they are presenting a bad argument. So if people are arguing that, for example, we should lower taxes equally just because they will benefit from lower taxes, doesn't automatically disqualify them. We can still and should listen to their argument, why should we lower taxes, and then decide whether or not it is a good argument. Dismissing it just by saying, oh, he'll benefit from that, therefore it's nonsense, that is a fallacy. And this is an ad hominem circumstantial. Tu quoque. Tu quoque means you too, and it actually explains how this variety of ad hominem works. In this case, they point at somebody's doing something in the past which now he argues against. And therefore, they're saying he or she being hypocritical. They did that, and now they argue against it. Here's an example. Kim Kardashian argues that women should not have children out of wedlock. But who is she to talk? She gave birth to her daughter North without being married. Clearly Kardashian's arguments is not worth listening to. Now, what is the problem here? Can she make argument like this, and should we listen to it? The argument again that you should not have children out of wedlock. Even though she did. She had a child out of wedlock. But does she have a right now to argue against it? You don't think she should be able to argue, or you don't think? So think about it in this way though. What if she did that, find out it's a very, very bad idea, and now she argues against it because on her personal experience, she knows what a bad idea it is. It sounds hypocritical, but in the same time, doesn't she have a right now to tell us what she really thinks about this issue? Yeah, that's one situation. So yeah, she could have changed through this experience. Just because she went through this experience doesn't disqualify her from making an argument. Even more than that, actually somebody may be hypocritical and yet making a good argument. Let's look at the next example so you guys could see. A 12-year-old can argue as follows. Dad tells me I shouldn't lie. He says lying is wrong because it makes people stop trusting one another. But I've heard my dad lie. Sometimes he calls in sick to work when he's not really sick. So lying isn't actually wrong. Dad just doesn't like it when I lie. So you see what's going on here. The child is saying, my dad tells me not to lie, but he lies himself. Well, he's right. We all lie, right? Who here never lied in your lifetime? Is there any single person who can honestly say, I've never lied? Probably everybody did. But does it mean that we should never say that lying is wrong, especially to our children? Of course not. Yes, it's true that people lie. Yes, it's true everyone lies. It is also true that it's not nice to lie and you should not be lying. And of course, even though we do that, we have every right to tell our children and to tell each other that it's bad. And we know it's bad. And we know we shouldn't do it. So it may seem hypocritical. In fact, it kind of is hypocritical, but it still is a good argument. The argument itself may still be good. Just because somebody done it in the past doesn't mean that they are precluded forever from making an argument. Okay, sometimes, however, what may seem like ad hominem may not be an ad hominem. Again, a good example is this. This is actually true. Some scholars, historians, make this argument about Shakespeare. They are saying Shakespeare cannot possibly have written the 36 plays attributed to him because the real Shakespeare was a two-bit country businessman who barely finished the 4th grade in school and never left confines of his native England. Absolutely true. Real Shakespeare was a very poorly educated person. He was more of a businessman than an academic, and he never left England. These are facts. So some scholars are saying, well, then how could he have possibly written such elaborate plays? If you read Shakespeare, or if you saw the movies or whatever, he talks about Italy, he talks about Denmark, countries he's never been to. And remember, at the time there was no television. It wasn't that easy to find out these things. And he also has these elaborate storylines, which for somebody with 4th grade education, it does seem like a little too much. Well, just out of fairness, most scholars say still that they think he did write it. And there's only a minority of scholars who doubt it and who present these arguments. But the point here is, regardless of that, this is a legitimate argument. In this case, it's not an ad hominem. Why not? Because it's actually relevant. The fact that he didn't get good education and the fact that he never left England is relevant to whether or not he was able to write this elaborate plays. So it's not an attack of the person, it is part of the argument. And so in this case, there's no fallacy. In court sometimes too, like for example, if it's a witness testimony and a lawyer can say, Mickey has testified that he saw Freddy set fire to the building, but Mickey was recently convicted on 10 counts of perjury and he hates Freddy with a passion and would love to see him sent to jail. Therefore, you should not believe Mickey's testimony. Now, is this a fallacy? No, because it's actually irrelevant again. Whether or not Mickey will benefit from the result of his testimony is relevant to the fact that whether we should trust Mickey. Note that Mickey is not even making an argument. He is just testifying to something he supposedly saw. And because we are taking his word as to whether or not he indeed saw that, we have every right to question whether he has personal motives and whether or not he is a trustworthy individual. So again, not a fallacy. Accident we say is a type of fallacy when some sort of general rule misapplied to a specific case. Something like this. Freedom of speech is a constitutionally guaranteed right, therefore John Q. Radical should not be arrested for his speech that incited riot last week. Now it is true that there is a general rule or constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech, the First Amendment, right? But in this case it is misapplied, because if he incited riot, there's actually Supreme Court decisions on the subject that in cases like this the freedom of speech does not apply. You cannot say anything you want at any time. For example, there's also a famous example, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. Why? Because if you actually do that, you will cause panic, people will get hurt as a result, and you should be responsible for this. So if there is fire, or if you think there is fire, it's one thing. But if you're just doing it for fun or whatever, no freedom of speech for you. you will be prosecuted. So there certainly are cases when it doesn't apply. Another example here, Zoe promised to meet Ethan for coffee, but while she was walking to local Starbucks, a pedestrian collapsed on the sidewalk right in front of her, and she stopped to administer CPR. Since people are obligated to keep their promises, it was wrong for Zoe to miss her appointment with Ethan. Like, wait a minute. It is true that people are supposed to keep their promises, but aren't we kind of misapplying this rule here? She administered CPR to save somebody's life. I mean, you would think that's more important than keeping your appointments on time. So again, if you misapply a rule like that, that is a fallacy of an accident. And finally, a straw man. The last one for today. What is a straw man? A straw man is basically when a particular argument been made, but a person who addresses this and who attacks this argument distorts it. And instead of attacking the actual argument which has been made, attacks this straw man, or the kind of another argument he built similar to the first one and yet different in some important way. Here's an example. Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in public schools. Obviously, Mr. Goldberg advocates atheism, but atheism is what they used to have in Russia. Atheism leads to suppression of all religion and replacement of God by omnipotent state. Is that what we want in this country? I hardly think so. Clearly, Mr. Goldberg's argument is nonsense. Again, note what is going on. Mr. Goldberg made some sort of an argument. We don't even know the details of it. He advocates against prayer in public schools. Does that necessarily mean he advocates atheism? Of course not. In fact, he may present something like, there are many different religions, right? So maybe he's Muslim or whatever other denomination. And what he could be saying is, if we have public prayer in schools, say Christian prayer, that could be offensive to Muslims. This is not something they can do. And in fact, there could be a variety of other arguments there which you can present, and that doesn't necessarily advocate atheism in any shape or form, and it certainly has nothing to do with atheism in Russia leading to omnipotent state. Now you can see how the whole thing is like really kind of distorted, and then in the end the question becomes, do we want to be like Russia? Where did that come from? That is a completely distorted argument. And so of course most people will agree we don't want to be like Russia, but that has nothing to do with the original argument. The argument wasn't even about Russia, right? So that is a straw man. Another example, diesel evolutionists believe that a dog can give birth to a cat. How ridiculous. Okay, wait a minute. When did evolutionists ever say that a dog can give birth to a cat? See that there is clearly a distortion going on here. In some cases, you can also see that slight variety when some sort of unnecessary assumption has been made in order to distort the argument, such as this. Susan advocates for legalization of cocaine, but I cannot agree with any position based on the assumption that cocaine is good for you and that a society of drug addicts can flourish. So I agree with Susan. I disagree with Susan. Now, what is the assumption? Here, he's clearly making an assumption that since she advocates legalization of cocaine, she thinks that cocaine is good for you. But does it have to be the case? Do people who advocate for whatever drugs to be legalized always think that it is good for you and that the society with drugs can flourish? No, of course not. In fact, one of the most popular arguments which many people make for legalization of drugs is this. Drugs is a huge source of revenue for mafia, for organized crime. They make in them, and it costs like literally pennies to make drugs such as cocaine, heroin. They're very cheap to produce. And then they sell in them with huge profit. And where does this profit go? It's not taxed or anything. It goes right into the pockets of mafia, and then mafia can buy politicians and so on with this money. Another argument there is, well, not everybody on drugs is wealthy, right? Some people are actually very poor. In fact, if you are on drugs, you'd probably lose your job and you will become even more poor. And then where do they get the money for this? Well, they commit crimes. All sorts of crimes are committed because people have this need to come up with rather substantial amounts of money to pay for drugs such as heroin, for example. So they rob, they steal, they break into houses. Now, if it was sold officially, the government could actually make the price very, very low. They could be selling this heroin doses for $1. Of course, it doesn't mean it would be good for you. And in fact, the argument can be made that if it is so cheap and easily affordable, many more people can go on drugs. Not a fact, but okay. But in the same time, that would also mean that these people no longer would have a need to rob and steal and break into houses because it would not cost them as much money. Whereas in fact, the way mafia charges, it's very expensive. It's an extremely expensive habit. And the only two types of people can afford it. Very wealthy people or criminals. People who break the law and get this money from some sort of illegal activity. So this could be the arguments made there. None of them note that saying that it is actually good for you. People agree that it is bad for you, but they just saying, well, maybe it's a better solution to have it available rather than have mafia sell it, because people still buying it, but the mafia is the one who benefits from it, and people have to pay a lot of money which they do not have, and then as a result they commit the crime, all these crimes. Yeah, so it is an unnecessary assumption. Okay, now let's do our exercises. We are done with the material. Hopefully you guys did pay attention, and hopefully you'll get more extra credit, which you do need for the next exam. Okay, the next exercise is just like the one we did before. This is for 3.1 section, and the question is the same. Formal or informal for all these three fallacies. Let's see if you get it better than the first time. The first person who gets it correctly gets extra credit. I think it's relatively easy one. Okay. Formal, informal, formal. That is actually correct. Good job, Cameron. Alright, yeah, that is true. The first and the last one are actually types of hypothetical syllogisms again, so both of them are formal. Whereas the one in the middle is an example of ad hominem abusive, right? They're saying Mark Zuckerberg argues in favor of opening up Arctic National Refuge, but he is money-grabbing capitalist. So essentially they are, in this case, abusing him. Okay, now let's try something a little more complicated. Now this is based on the fallacies we covered, and your job here is to identify specific fallacies we just talked about. So that's also why I told you guys to keep notes or to keep some sort of record and pay attention. Because to get this extra credit, you actually, it's not enough. I don't even care if it's formal or informal. What you should tell me is specifically, if there is a fallacy, what it is, and there may be no fallacy, in which case you should say no fallacy. So for these three, try to identify specific fallacies or say no fallacy. Okay, anybody wants to try that? Remember, there is no penalty for trying. I mean, if you get it wrong, so what? No big deal. Okay, ad hominem, you have to be more specific than just ad hominem. Abuse, ad hominem abusive is a type of ad hominem. So essentially, what you're saying is the last one is also ad hominem. But you have to be a little more specific. Remember, there are three types of ad hominem: abusive, circumstantial, and tout quoi quer. You have to distinguish these three. Okay, so Richard, your then answer is ad hominem circumstantial, bandwagon, and no fallacy. Okay, well, you actually are absolutely right. So you do get your second extra credit. Yes, ad hominem circumstantial. This is an excellent example. Take a look at it. Erica Evans, who takes orders at the local Taco Bell, argues persuasively in favor of increasing minimum wage. But this is exactly what you would expect. Erica is paid minimum wage, and if the minimum wage is increased, then her own salary will go up. Obviously, Erica's arguments are worthless. So what are they saying there? They are saying that she is a waitress, she's on minimum wage, therefore she'll benefit from it, and even though she presents supposedly persuasive argument, we shouldn't listen to it, just based on the fact that she'll benefit from that. So remember, this is why I told you that anytime somebody says something like this is ad hominem, and it is ad hominem circumstantial. They're not saying she's a bad person, so it's not abusive. They're not saying she did something herself against which she is arguing, so it's not tout quoque. In this case, it is circumstantial. But you have to be able to distinguish among the three. Now, the next one is indeed bandwagon, which is indeed indirect approach of appeal to the people. So either one of this version would be okay. Bandwagon is more specific, but I would even accept indirect approach. But the last one is, of course, no fallacy. Why? Well, because it's a formal argument, right? It's hypothetical syllogism, and it actually is a perfectly valid hypothetical syllogism. And so, whether or not, and remember one more thing, when you are told this, you may wonder, is it even true? Well, again, we don't really care. We are assuming that whatever we are told is true. We don't know if Erica Evans works at Taco Bell. We don't even care. We're assuming this is true, and then we're evaluating the argument based on this assumption. And we're asking ourselves, does the conclusion follow from what we are told, assuming this is true? And in the last case, it does follow, of course. So that is not a fallacy. Good job. So yeah, okay, let's do one more. Let's see if you guys now, based on this experience, can again successfully do this one. Same thing. Fallacy, no fallacy. If there is a fallacy, which one? No, in this case you are wrong. Anybody else? That is not correct. Okay, we are kind of out of time, so let me just give you this one. Okay, note that number 24 is indeed tout quoque, and it's a good example of tout quoque, right? So tout quoque. Dr. Morrison argues against smoking, but he's smoking himself. Well, so what? He's a doctor, right? He knows that smoking is bad for you. Is it bad that he's smoking himself? Yes, it's bad. It does make him a little bit hypocritical, but if you know anything about smoking, it's one of those habits which kind of hard to get rid of. So, while it may indeed make him a little hypocritical, he may still present a perfectly good argument, and he probably does. So, it is tout quoque. Now, what's the difference with 18? Well, for one thing, it wouldn't be tout quoque, because they're not saying Rudolf Höss killed people himself, therefore he cannot argue against killing people. He's not arguing against anything. They're just saying Rudolf Höss murdered 1 million people, and based on that we can conclude that he is either insane or extremely evil person. Is that even a fallacy? No, it's not a fallacy at all. In fact, we are perfectly justified to conclude that. That's the difference there. I told you, it's not always a fallacy, right? You have to use your common sense and read through the argument. And this is, of course, appeal to force. Again, a good example of appeal to force. So I'm not going to give anybody extra credit for this one. Christian, I don't know what means, so and that was not a straw man. But, okay, we're out of time now. Don't forget to do the homework for 3.1. I will upload, of course, this on YouTube as usual too, if you want to rewatch it, and maybe something was too fast for you or whatever. Now that it's not in classroom, There's a good thing about it that you can always rewatch it again and perhaps get it if you didn't get it first time. Or you don't have to if you don't want to. Okay, so that would be all for today. I will see you on Tuesday. Do not forget the homework, and thank you very much, guys. Have a good weekend.